Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about Carmelo Anthony, and as you all know, Carmelo Anthony retired the other day after a very long NBA career, so we're going to be talking about his entire career going back to high school, so stay tuned. Now, in Carmelo Anthony's early career, he would attend Townsend Catholic High School, and he was a phenom on the court, averaging 23 points per game, but there was underlying issues, and those issues were that he was suspended a lot of the time because he was skipping classes. And for his senior season, his mom made him transfer schools, and he would end up transferring to the famous Oak Hill High School. And he would lead Oak Hill High School to a 32-1 record. And this would lead him to getting accepted into Syracuse, where he would spend his freshman and only season in college. In Carmelo Anthony's freshman season at Syracuse, he would average 22 points per game on 45% shooting with 10 rebounds. I mean, he was absolutely insane. And Syracuse would end up being the number 3 seed in the tournament, and they would go all the way to the national championship, where they would take on number 2 Kansas, and Syracuse would win that game, and Carmelo Anthony, as a freshman, led Syracuse to a national championship win and was the tournament's most outstanding player. And in my opinion, and many other people's opinions, Carmelo Anthony is the greatest college freshman of all time. Now, you would think going into the 2003 NBA draft that Carmelo Anthony would be the number 1 pick, right? Well, you see, every other year, Carmelo Anthony would more than likely be the number 1 pick, but it just so happens that the greatest, arguably the greatest, prospect to ever come into the NBA draft was in that draft as well, and I'm of course talking about LeBron James, who was coming straight out of high school, and the Cleveland Cavaliers would take LeBron James with the first pick. The second pick in the draft belonged to Detroit, the Detroit Pistons, and you would think they would pick Carmelo Anthony too, but instead they picked Darko Milicic. That did not work out well for them at all, and the Pistons, although they would win the championship in 2004, which with Carmelo Anthony, it definitely would have been a lot easier for them to win that championship in 2004, and it's one of the biggest what-ifs in NBA history, which led the Denver Nuggets with the number 3 pick to get extremely lucky, and they would pick Carmelo Anthony 3rd overall. The Denver Nuggets were terrible in 2002 as they would win 17 games, and the next season with a rookie Carmelo Anthony and a new addition of point guard Andre Miller, they would go from 17 wins to 43 wins. Carmelo Anthony absolutely carried the Nuggets, averaging 21 points per game on 42% shooting. And despite them losing to the Timberwolves in 5 games in the first round, it showed that Carmelo Anthony was ready to carry a team immediately, and he probably should have won Rookie of the Year, but because of all the headlines and all that, LeBron James would end up winning Rookie of the Year, even though Carmelo Anthony was definitely more deserving. Going into Carmelo Anthony's second season, the Denver Nuggets once again made new changes to the team, and that was a draft night trade that would bring in Kenyon Martin, the former number 1 pick in the 2000 draft, and he was coming off an all-star season with the Nets. And the Nuggets would end up winning 49 games that season. Carmelo Anthony would average 21 points per game on 43% shooting, but they would once again lose in 5 games in the first round to the San Antonio Spurs. Going into Melo's 3rd season, Jeff Bzdelik, the former head coach, would be fired, and they would hire George Karl to be the new head coach. And Carmelo Anthony would take the next steps in becoming a superstar that season, averaging 26.5 points per game on 48% shooting, and would lead the Nuggets to 44 wins. And they would end up losing yet again in 5 games to the Clippers this time. And Carmelo Anthony somehow did not make an all-star team that year, despite averaging 26 points per game on very efficient numbers and leading his team to the playoffs. In the middle of the 06-07 season, the Denver Nuggets felt the need to make yet another splash, and they made a big splash. And going into that season, they had acquired J.R. Smith in a trade, but the big splash here was trading for Allen Iverson, who obviously a former MVP, but the year before he averaged 33 points per game, so this is exactly the superstar help that Carmelo Anthony needed. Carmelo Anthony himself would average 29 points per game that season on 47% shooting. He had arguably the best year of his career, and the Nuggets would win 45 games, but once again in the first round would be eliminated in 5 games by the Spurs again. Now, the Denver Nuggets, to this point, were yet to make it out of the first round in Carmelo Anthony's career. And going into the 2007-2008 season, the pressure was mounting, and the team would end up winning 50 games, but they would be swept by the Lakers, and that showed that change needed to be made in Denver, as Carmelo Anthony would have a really good season, averaging 25 points per game on 49% shooting, but it wasn't enough. 3 games into the 2008-2009 season, Allen Iverson's time with the Denver Nuggets would be cut short. He would be traded to the Detroit Pistons in exchange for Chauncey Billups, a former Finals MVP, and Chauncey Billups, he may not have been as good of a player as Allen Iverson was, but still, he was exactly what Denver needed, and the Denver Nuggets would end up winning 54 games that season. In the first round, the Denver Nuggets would face off against the New Orleans Hornets, and finally, for the first time in the Carmelo Anthony era, the Denver Nuggets would make it out of the first round, defeating the Hornets in 5 games, and in the second round, they would face off against the Dallas Mavericks, where they would win in 5 games yet again. And that would set up a Western Conference Finals rematch against the Los Angeles Lakers. And unfortunately for the Nuggets, they would end up losing this series in 6 games, but this was the best Denver Nuggets team in their franchise history, and Carmelo Anthony had a great playoff run, averaging 27 points per game throughout the playoff run, and the future looked bright with a veteran Chauncey Billups leading the way at point guard. Going into the 2009-2010 season, the Denver Nuggets looked like they could possibly win the championship, and Carmelo Anthony backed up all the talk, averaging 28 points per game on 43% shooting, but unfortunately, despite a 53-win season for the Nuggets, they would end up losing in the first round to the Utah Jazz in 6 games, and that would lead Carmelo Anthony to his breaking point, and he would request a trade from the Denver Nuggets. Going into the 2010-2011 season, despite the trade requests, Carmelo Anthony would continue playing for Denver, and finally, at the trade deadline, the Denver Nuggets would make Carmelo Anthony's wish come true, and they would trade him to the New York Knicks in a massive 3-team trade where Carmelo Anthony would be sent to New York alongside Chauncey Billups in a trade where Denver, it seemed like at the time they got nothing for Carmelo Anthony, but in reality they would get a first-round pick that would later become Jamal Murray, a playoff hero. So I guess it worked out perfectly fine for Denver. Maybe not at the time though. Anyway, Carmelo Anthony would arrive in New York, and he would already have a new look as he would change his number to number 7. Carmelo Anthony would be joined by another superstar teammate, Amari Stoudemire, in New York, who had signed with the team before the 2010-2011 season, and the Knicks would end up winning 42 games that season, but they would be swept in the first round by the Boston Celtics. But the future looked bright in New York, led by Carmelo Anthony and Amari Stoudemire, as Carmelo Anthony that season would average 26 points per game as a Knick. Going into the 2011-2012 season, the New York Knicks made some big moves, and they would bring in Tyson Chandler, a great defensive player down low, and they would make an under-the-radar move that nobody really talked about until the season had already been in full swing, and that was Jeremy Lin. And we'll get to Lin's sanity later, but all of this had to wait because the NBA was in a lockout. But on Christmas Day 2011, the NBA season would resume, and the New York Knicks would end up winning 36 games in the lockout shortened season, and they would lose in 5 games in the playoffs to the Miami Heat. Carmelo Anthony would average 23 points per game that season on 45% shooting, but there were some great scorers on that team like Amari Stoudemire, but then also Jeremy Lin came out of nowhere and shocked the world and really took over and was a great player for the Knicks. But that offseason, he would end up signing a mega contract with the Houston Rockets. Now, the 2012-2013 season was quite an eventful season for Carmelo Anthony's career. The New York Knicks were a very good team that season, as J.R. Smith would end up having a breakout season as he joined Carmelo Anthony from the Hornets, and he would average 18 points per game, and a bunch of former Denver Nuggets would come and join the Knicks that season, including Marcus Camby and Kenyon Martin. But they also had some past their prime guys like Jason Kidd on the team. And all of this came together to create a 54-win team after Mike D'Antoni, the head coach, had left to go coach the Los Angeles Lakers' failed super team. And they would hire current IU head coach Mike Woodson to be the head coach of the team. They would win 54 games, and Carmelo Anthony had arguably the best season of his career, averaging 28 points per game on 44% shooting, and he would end up being the NBA scoring champion that season. In the first round, they would win in 6 games against the Boston Celtics. But in the second round, they would take on the Indiana Pacers led by Paul George, and they would end up losing this series in 6 games as Carmelo Anthony got absolutely embarrassed by Roy Hibbert. Now, in Carmelo Anthony's 10th season in the 2013-2014 season, the New York Knicks were not as good. They would finish the season with only 37 wins, and they would miss out on the playoffs. But the most important thing about that season for Carmelo Anthony, he had arguably the best season of his career scoring-wise, averaging 27.5 points per game on 45% shooting. And this also included a 62-point performance against the Charlotte Bobcats. Now, that offseason, Carmelo Anthony was a free agent, and he had plenty of options. He said in interviews that he almost signed with the Chicago Bulls, and he also almost signed with the Los Angeles Lakers to pair up with the aging Kobe Bryant. But Carmelo Anthony would opt to stay with the New York Knicks on a 5-year, $121 million contract. Now, the 2014-2015 season saw big changes for the Knicks. Derek Fisher was hired as the new head coach of the team, and the team overall was terrible. And Tyson Chandler had left that offseason. But either way, they would have been a terrible team. Carmelo Anthony would battle knee injuries all season, especially early on, and he would only play 40 games. And he would average 24.5 points per game on 44% shooting when he was healthy. So he was very productive when healthy. But still, this was the first time that injuries kind of caught up with Carmelo Anthony, and the Knicks would absolutely blow it up before the trade deadline, trading Amari Stoudemire, J.R. Smith, and Iman Shumpert. So the Knicks had absolutely went into full rebuild mode, and when Carmelo Anthony was injured, the Knicks would have to be carried by Andrea Bargnani. So the Knicks would end up only winning 17 games, and they would land the 4th pick in the 2015 NBA draft, where they picked up Kristaps Porzingis, which was seen as a very terrible pick at the time, but Porzingis would prove himself to be a great player. The 2015-2016 season for the Knicks saw big improvement overall, as they would finish with 32 wins, and Carmelo Anthony would have a bounce-back season when it comes to health, as he would play 72 games. And he would average 22 points per game on 43% shooting in those 72 games. And although Kristaps Porzingis had a really good rookie year, it was pretty evident that Carmelo Anthony at the age of 31 was nearing the end of his prime. And if the Knicks wanted to build around Carmelo Anthony to build a contender, they would have to do it quickly because they were running out of time. Going into the 2016-2017 season for the Knicks, they had sky-high expectations as a new head coach was in the building with Jeff Hornacek, and they would make a big-time trade to land both Derrick Rose and Joakim Noah, so the Knicks looked like they could be a playoff team once again, with Carmelo Anthony, the aging superstar, and the young star in Kristaps Porzingis. But the Knicks would absolutely disappoint as per usual. Carmelo Anthony would have a healthy and a really good productive season, averaging 23 points per game on 43% shooting. But the Knicks, 31 wins, they would miss the playoffs yet again. And it was time for Carmelo Anthony's time in New York to end, as he had a no-trade clause in his contract, but he was only willing to be traded to the Houston Rockets to pair with James Harden and Chris Paul. But he would end up changing his stance, and he would be traded to the Oklahoma City Thunder right before the 2017-2018 season. He was traded for Enes Kanter, and the Thunder looked like they had a big three going with Russell Westbrook, Paul George, and now Carmelo Anthony. But the 2017-2018 season would be the worst season of Carmelo Anthony's career so far, as he would average 16 points per game, but with a not so good 40% from the field. He couldn't keep up on defense, and overall Carmelo Anthony did not look good with the Thunder. The Thunder would win 48 games, and they would be eliminated in the first round by the Utah Jazz. But still, Carmelo Anthony did not look good that season for the Thunder, and it was time for him to find a new home that offseason yet again. That offseason, the Thunder would trade Carmelo Anthony to the Atlanta Hawks in a 3-team trade, but the Atlanta Hawks would end up cutting Carmelo Anthony 10 days later. But the Houston Rockets in August would end up signing Carmelo Anthony, and Carmelo Anthony would only play 10 games for the Rockets, and he would average 10 points per game on 40% shooting. And he would end up getting traded at the 2019 trade deadline to the Chicago Bulls, and the Bulls would end up cutting him only a few days later. So people were questioning whether Carmelo Anthony's NBA career was over at this point. It looks like Carmelo Anthony's NBA career was over, but the Portland Trail Blazers in November of 2019 would end up signing Carmelo Anthony to a multi-year contract, and the big risk would pay off as Carmelo Anthony revived his career, averaging 15 points per game on 43% shooting. And although Carmelo Anthony went from being a star to a role player, he accepted that role, and he became a very good role player in the NBA. But in March of 2020, the NBA would be suspended because of COVID, and they would resume play in July, and Carmelo Anthony and the Trailblazers would end up losing to the number 1 seed Los Angeles Lakers in the first round, who would go on to win the championship that year. But still, Carmelo Anthony looked like he had a lot more to give to the NBA as a role player. The 2020-2021 season would end up being a huge season for Carmelo Anthony's career despite his age, and that was because for the first time he was really a bench player. He was coming off the bench. He had only started 3 games that season, and he averaged 13 points per game on 42% shooting. And even with Carmelo Anthony's new role, the Trailblazers would win 42 games, but they would lose in the first round to the Denver Nuggets. But Carmelo Anthony would be a free agent that offseason. Going into the 2021-2022 season, Carmelo Anthony was now 37 years old and looking for a new home, and he would not find that new home until August, only 2 months before the season would begin, and the Los Angeles Lakers would end up signing Carmelo Anthony to a 1-year deal, and Carmelo Anthony would be united with arguably his best friend LeBron James, which probably played a huge factor in him signing with the Lakers. And once again, he was really primarily a bench player, and he would only start 3 games again. This time he would average 13 points per game on 44% shooting. The Lakers were not good though, as they would be 11th in the Western Conference, which was a disappointing finish for them considering that they had traded for Russell Westbrook. And Carmelo Anthony, at the age of 38, was going to be a free agent yet again. That offseason, Carmelo Anthony would go unsigned, which only meant one thing. It was time to hang it up, and Carmelo Anthony retired in May of 2023. Now, Carmelo Anthony's career is definitely a first ballot Hall of Fame career, a top 10 scorer of all time, and overall, despite not winning a championship, Carmelo Anthony had an incredible career. And the question is, what teams will retire his number? I think the New York Knicks will definitely retire his number, but the Denver Nuggets is kind of in the air. You would think they would retire his number, but also they have another incredible player that wore the number 15, Nikola Jokic, who delivered the Nuggets their first championship the other night. So it's kind of up in the air. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Carmelo Anthony, one of my favorite players of all time, and let me know in the comments what player I should do next. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.